All right, good morning and welcome to Abolitionists' Approach to Public Safety. Very much looking forward to hearing remarks from this interdisciplinary panel today, as well as hearing your questions and comments as well. So I'm going to start off, let's see. Okay. All right, so I want to start off with just a brief introduction, but I want to spend the majority of our time hearing from our panelists. This is just not working. Okay, so brief introduction. So today we have Aliza Cohen, who is the research coordinator at Drug Policy Alliance's Department of Research and Academic Engagement, where she conducts research on evidence-based approaches to substance use and regularly collaborates with academics across the country. Jamelia Morgan is a professor at the Northwestern School of Law and director of the Center for Racial and Disability Justice. Her scholarship focuses on the intersections of race, gender, disability, and criminal law and punishment. Ieshaah Murphy is an assistant professor of law and director of the Criminal Law Clinic at the University of District of Columbia Law School. Prior to joining UDC Law, Professor Murphy was a senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Maryland and practiced for over 8 years as a trial attorney at the Public Defender Service for DC. Finally, Alex Vitale is professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. He is the author of The End of Policing and City of Disorder and has spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consulting with police departments and human rights organizations internationally. Okay, so today we're going to have a slightly different approach to a traditional panel. I'm aware that folks in the room may have differing familiarity with abolition. Some may have been introduced to abolitionist literature in the academy or elsewhere. Some may only know what it is based on media reports or the statements of select political stakeholders. So the goal of today is twofold. First, to introduce you all to abolitionist theory through an interdisciplinary lens, given the varied areas and experiences of the panelists. And second, to have our panelists directly respond to the claims that are often made in support of legal reform as opposed to abolition. So we're going to start off with opening remarks from each panelist, and then we'll move into 4 particular claims that are often leveled against abolition, and each of our panelists will respond in turn. I'll then reserve approximately 10 to 15 minutes for questions from you all, so please jot them down as we move through the presentation. Okay, without further ado, maybe this clicker will work for me. Okay, great. All right, so I'd like each of our panelists to start off by just giving us an idea of how they conceptualize abolition. I'd like to start with Aliza. Is it Aliza or Aliza? I feel like Aliza, okay.
Okay. Thanks, Sean, and thanks so much for having us. I should say first that Drug Policy Alliance is a policy advocacy organization. We're in the business of doing incremental policy change. So we have done work with abolitionists, but we've also done work with prosecutors and cops as well. All right, so when thinking about drugs, public safety, and abolition, it's imperative that first we recognize that most drug-related harms like overdose, deaths, infectious diseases, or drug market violence come from drug prohibition and the accompanying logics and practices of criminalization, surveillance, and coercion, not from drugs themselves. It's not the drugs, it's the drug policies. Since the rapid escalation of the war on drugs and in the name of stopping drug use and sales, we've seen over 1 million drug arrests each year. We've built up highly aggressive police forces and pumped billions of dollars of drug enforcement money and free military equipment to police departments. And we've spent more than $666 billion on federal drug control programs. Nearly 60% of that money has gone to drug war policing and military, rather than to programs like harm reduction, treatment, and drug education. And of course, these policies have had especially profound impacts on Black, Latinx, and Native people. But our drug policies overall have failed to reduce violence, problematic drug use, drug-related infectious diseases, or overdose deaths. I want to propose that it's not just that our drug laws have a negligible impact on public safety and health, but that they are antithetical to public safety and health. So let's talk about how. Prohibition has helped cause the over 1 million overdose deaths we've seen since the onset of the crisis. And prohibition is responsible for the current toxic supply of illicit drugs. The US government has increased penalties and doubled down on enforcement and supply side interdiction efforts as a strategy to stop drug production and entry. However, this has only caused new drugs to emerge. As we have seen with the rise of fentanyl, xylazine, and other adulterants, manufacturers and distributors in the illicit market are incentivized to produce more potent and often more dangerous drugs, which are easier to transport and hide from law enforcement. In an unregulated market, there are no forces to safeguard against contaminants. We're in a game of drug war whack-a-mole, and people who use drugs are often not aware of exactly what they're using or what effects the drugs will have. Arresting and incarcerating people, which is one of the primary paths we've taken to address drug use, has dramatic health impacts, as we all know, especially for people who use drugs. For example, between 2001 and 2018, the number of people who died of drug or alcohol intoxication in state prisons rose a harrowing 600%. Overdose risk is significantly greater following an extended period of abstinence or reduced use, such as spending time behind bars. Compared to the general population, those returning to the community from jail or prison have a 10 to 40 times higher risk of overdose death within the first 2 weeks after their release. And despite the significant increase in drug arrests and incarceration we've seen over the past decades, drug use has still remained relatively stable over time. In recent years, we've seen a softening in rhetoric towards people who use drugs in favor of increased vitriol towards and penalties for people who sell drugs. This approach, too, I would argue, is also misguided and doesn't keep us safer. Research shows that drug enforcement is unlikely to reduce drug market violence or reduce overdose fatalities. Instead, removing trusted sellers from communities, for example, could have unintended public health consequences like overdose. And drug sellers are poised to offer harm reduction strategies and information about drug contents and quality for people who use drugs. We also know that punitive drug policies go beyond arrest and incarceration and impact systems like housing, education, public benefits, and healthcare. The drug war's deep roots into our everyday lives makes us unhealthier and more unsafe. Punishment and denial of services of care for real or even suspected drug use are routine features of our public civil systems. Drug war practices that remove people from society, restrict access to basic necessities, and punish people and separate families result in the very harms that our policies supposedly seek to eliminate. Not having a home, not making a livable wage, and being food insecure, for example, all contribute to increased problematic drug use and increased drug-related harms. If we had what we needed, financial security, housing, an unadulterated drug supply that isn't killing us, non-coercive and accessible support for people who do struggle with drug use, we would actually address the issues of crime, public safety, and public health that are dominating today's news cycles and elections. So what do I think abolition has to offer? Abolition is, of course, a refusal to believe that we can criminalize our way out of an overdose crisis. It's a vision for a different world where safety doesn't come from the police, from courts, prisons, or jails, or coerced hospitalizations and detentions, but instead from each other and from our communities. And as organizers, thinkers, and writers like Miriam Kaba and Ruth Wilson Gilmore urge, abolition is an everyday ongoing practice and struggle. First, abolition that requires that we turn inward. We should be asking ourselves, our loved ones, and our neighborhoods and communities why certain drug use, especially public drug use, is such a problem. Why is our instinct to disappear people to jails, detention centers, and hospitals? Can we push ourselves not to be revolted by drug use itself, but by the fact that using in public means that people are using more hastily, might not have access to sterile supplies, and might be especially afraid to call 911 in the case of an overdose? Abolition requires turning inward to challenge divisions between people deserving of care and undeserving of care. Abolition also requires dismantling carceral and surveillance systems beyond prisons and jails. It requires that we look not just at the criminal legal system, but at the ways in which public civil systems that are meant to support often actually harm people. It asks us to interrogate how seemingly routine features of our support systems, like drug testing, like mandated reporting, information sharing between agencies, can actually destroy the lives of people who use drugs in repeated and compounding ways. Abolition demands that we understand that cops are no longer the drug war's only enforcers, but that healthcare providers, social workers, and counselors can police us too. Thus, abolition requires deep intentional organizing and building across movements. Abolition requires that we ask, what do we want and need, not just how do we make our current systems of treatment and harm reduction better? How can we build up treatment infrastructure so that it looks nothing like it is now, so that it lacks high fees, coercive elements, and one-size-fits-all models? How can we envision harm reduction as not just a physical syringe exchange, but like groups like Next Distro, Bronx Mobile, and Smokeworks have, as literally meeting people where they are, whether that's through mail-based harm reduction services, mobile services, or the provision of safer drug use supplies beyond just needles? How can we envision a world beyond just fentanyl test strips, beyond naloxone, and imagine a world in which people who use drugs have access to a safe and legal supply of drugs? Abolition, after all, requires building and not just dismantling. Abolition requires resourcing our communities. It requires directing funding to community-based and grassroots harm reduction organizations who have an intimate understanding of a changing drug supply and how to mitigate risk for people who use drugs, who, before many policymakers and researchers ever could, understood how cataclysmic events like COVID-19 would impact people who use drugs, and who know how to get safer drug use supplies and harm reduction information to people discreetly, efficiently, and accessibly. Finally, abolition means drug user liberation. If we care about the lives of people who use drugs, which I think all of us here today do, we must care about the liberation and self-determination of people who use drugs. We can look to drug users' unions as groups who already are and have been practicing abolition. People who use drugs have long found safety from each other, not from cops, not from the courts, not from traditional healthcare. Drug users' unions have practiced abolition through demanding that every person who uses drugs is demanding of life, through asserting demands for bodily autonomy, as people in the reproductive justice space, in queer and trans liberation space, and disability justice spaces have done, through distributing syringes and pipes, even when it's not legal, through daring to set up overdose prevention sites, through testing and distributing their own drugs, like the Drug User Liberation Front in Canada has done to ensure that people can have access to a safer supply of drugs, and ultimately through caring for each other because of and in spite of the drug war. Safety, to me, as I understand it, doesn't mean a world without drugs. It means a world without the drug war. A world without the drug war, a world without criminalization might seem inconceivable, but a world where 1 million more of our loved ones die from overdose, and where millions more are torn apart by cages in hospitals, by our family policing system, and at the border is much more inconceivable to me. Abolition offers us a chance at a different world.
I really want to just echo some of what you've said. Okay, there we go. Particularly because, I want to start off with a broader bird's eye view of abolition, but you've also given us some real insights into the work that is already happening, the work that is ongoing. But just to echo some of what you've shared, abolition requires that we turn inward and that we ask hard questions, including why is it our instinct to disappear people? Second, that dismantlement has to be beyond police and prisons, that abolition is an invitation to abolish hierarchical power relationships beyond what we see in the realm of the carceral system. 3, that it involves deep intentional organizing and us identifying what we actually want and need. and it requires a drug user liberation and self-determination as represented by such organizations as Drug User Liberation Front. So thank you so much for starting us off with those very compelling words. I'd now like to move on to Jamelia Morgan, and you can also describe how you conceptualize abolition.
Sure. Well, I think Aliza did such a terrific job in sort of laying out the sort of theoretical foundations of abolition, its ambitions, and sort of central core principles. The only thing I guess I will sort of echo and maybe save the remainder of my remarks for the question and answer so as not to be repetitive, is to kind of hone in on a couple things. So one, this idea of experimentation. Miriam Kaba refers to abolition as, 1 million experiments and counting, right? So this idea that local communities are organizing to come up with sort of their own visions for responding to collective harm and conflict. And that when we think about the experimentation behind abolition and the theory and the grandiose ideas, we should see them as rooted in a practice, right? That's happening every day. I think about my new hometown, well, not hometown, but new home of Chicago, where we see violence interrupters, individuals that had engagements with their local community, may have been swept up into the web of criminalization, but returning to their communities to intervene and in disputes within blocks and across blocks. And so I think that we should think about abolition and its sort of ambition of not only alternatives, but radically reimagining social responses to all manner of harm, predation, and precarity, but just to root it in the fact that it's an experimentation that's ongoing in communities across the country. The last thing I would, or maybe not last thing, but a couple more things. All right, so this expanded vision of public safety. I've heard and read sort of Andrea Ritchie's account of public safety. And one of the things that she notes in a lot of her interviews and reporting is this idea that when you ask certain communities what their vision of public safety is and what safety means to them, that very often it doesn't include sort of the law enforcement response. And so one of the things that puts to my mind is the sense that we can collectively reimagine and expand the scope of what is safety and to really hone in on more inclusive notions of who counts as the public. And so in some sense, when I teach my criminal law class, I talk about how when we look at sort of the problem of violence in society, oftentimes we ignore the fact that much of the violence occurs behind these carceral spaces, whether they're prison walls or psychiatric institutions, jails, et cetera. And so I think that abolition invites us to sort of radically imagine who's included in this notion of the public. And I think that has implications for the way that, some of us scholars do our research, right? And thinking through who counts in these assessments as to harm. The other sort of thing that Aliza mentioned that I'll echo again is sort of interrogating criminal law responses to all manner of social problem. So I come to sort of the issue of thinking about, drugs and drug law enforcement as someone who's very much committed to thinking through how law regulates the boundaries of society, how law polices precarity and regulates marginality. And those are sort of highfalutin academic ways of saying, people that don't fit into dominant culture, that are cast aside within our social order, the unsheltered, individuals with psychiatric disabilities, and criminal law, I think, for a number of years, we've started to think more expansively about definitions of violence. And as Sean's paper, Professor Hill's paper did yesterday, kind of interrogating violence and the distinctions and the focus of violence in criminal law, and the sort of setting aside of the more routine, mundane ways that police are deployed to, again, manage populations that we've deemed to be disposable. And so when I think of the sort of, war on drugs, of course, I'm thinking through a race-based lens, and the fact that these policies have harmed historically and today low-income communities of color. But then I also think, kind of akin to the disability justice framing, about how even on the other side, presumably of a pandemic, we have not changed our responses to mental health. We have continued to have punitive responses to people in crisis, in some cases building law enforcement into the crisis response. And we have failed to recognize that our numbers for suicidality are increasing, that reliance on antidepressants and other pharmacological drugs are on the rise. And yet, in the face of this pandemic that we all experienced, albeit in uneven ways for sure, we're still not having that conversation about how to rethink, again, social responses and non-punitive, non-carceral responses to these particular individual and collective experiences. And so I turn to abolition as a scholar and a thinker, before that as a practitioner, for new directions, new possibilities. I'm reminded of some of the remarks from earlier panels. We'll talk a little bit about harm reduction. I do think you have to take, the first bite and, move forward one step at a time, but I'm not satisfied with just the incremental. I think that the story of abolition and the insights of abolition suggest that if we continue to sort of tinker at the edges, we'll just reconstitute all manner of social problems in new ways. And so I think in many senses, abolition offers us an analysis, a new way of thinking about problems, and also a new account of the possibilities, the potential responses to those particular problems. So I can speak more specifically in the Q&A portion, but those are my general thoughts.
Really appreciate these nuggets of theorists that folks can further look into. We've had some mention of Miriam Kaba, Andrea Ritchie. I'll also share some additional resources at the end of today's panel, but really appreciate this quote from Miriam Kaba. I have quite a lot of my own as well, that hope is a discipline. That's something that's always resonated with me, that she has remained hopeful in the work that she does. But this quote that you also gave, right, that abolition is 1 million experiments and counting, that abolition isn't exclusively a theory, it is a practice, it is happening, and it does require us to experiment in the ways that we often experiment with carceral responses, but to bring that experimentation to alternative approaches to safety. Really appreciate it. The statement that you incorporated into your criminal law course, that when you ask communities to, reimagine public safety or define public safety, they are not defining it in terms of police. And I am, very much aware of James Foreman has written about Black communities, locking up our own, supporting policies like the drug war prohibitionist policies. And so even though we have to move on, one question that I will come back to for Professor Morgan is, what is your response to that? What is your response to, Black and brown communities want police. They want people to be locked up. They don't want drug dealers on their corners. How do you respond to that? I certainly have some responses that I've generated over the last several years, but would especially appreciate hearing that from you. Okay, all right, so moving on, I'd now like to move on to Professor Murphy to define for us, particularly based on your practice experience, your work with the ACLU, how you think of conceptualize abolition.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So for me, abolition it's a practice. It's a state of mind, but it is most importantly, this constant state of learning and being open to new solutions to problems that have existed for centuries. I think for me, I care deeply about racial justice, Black liberation in this country. I want Black people to be free. I want Black people to be able to thrive. I want Black people to live healthy lives. And for me, you cannot achieve that without abolishing these systems that oppress Black and brown people. And so that is how I come to thinking about abolition. If I can ask just from a show of hands, how many of you identify as abolitionists? Oh, wow, that's more than I would have guessed. If you would have asked me 3 years ago if I was an abolitionist, I would have said to you, I think abolition is a wonderful concept. I would love a world where prisons didn't exist, where police didn't exist, where surveillance didn't exist, but I don't think it's realistic. I don't understand how people, not how will we be safe, because you don't have to convince me that these things don't make us safer, but how will people feel safe without them? How do people feel safe without police? How do people feel safe without prisons, right? And how do people get justice, right? Victims of crimes. That's what I think about when I think about a world where we don't have prisons, where we don't have police. And, 3 years ago, that answer would have come from my experience growing up and my experience in practice, right? I grew up in Buffalo, New York, in a all Black, low income community, and drugs were everywhere in my community. Drugs impacted my family extensively. Drug users, family members who were arrested for selling drugs. It was everywhere, right? And drugs were connected to violence in my community, gun violence, right? And, to Sean's point earlier, I grew up in a community where Black people wanted more police. I often heard that, right? We want more police presence. We want protection. We want to be treated like people, right? We want safety. And so, for me, it has always been difficult to ignore that segment of folks, right? Who desperately want to be protected like any person is protected in America, right? And when I started practicing, I saw the same thing. Many of the clients I represented would not themselves identify as abolitionists, right? Like many of the people I represented believe in a system of punishment, believe that they need to take accountability. And, in my role as a public defender, I to take pleas, to go to prison, all of these things, right? And so, a turning point really came for me in the pandemic, and it wasn't, George Floyd's murder. It wasn't the protests. It wasn't the racial reckoning. It was representing folks who are incarcerated during this tragic pandemic, right? And it was going to court and arguing for basic human decency, right? For my client to be able to take a shower after he has been diagnosed with COVID and vomiting and defecating in a cage and hasn't been removed for 2 to 3 days, right? I'd never experienced something so disgusting and so, horrible. What people were saying in court, what prosecutors were arguing, right? Arguing about whether my client gets 1 bar of soap or 2 bars of soap. Like, are we going to provide free laundry detergent or still charge them? Like, these types of things were just like, I couldn't believe what was happening, right? And I think I really had to look internally and examine why I put so much, why I held abolition to this higher standard than I did the current system, right? In my mind, you have to prove to me that alternatives will work. You have to prove that these interventions will make us safe. You have to prove that they'll make people feel like they got justice, right? But the current system is not doing that. So why am I holding abolition to this higher standard? Why am I not willing to experiment and to try new things and to just go forth and tear it down and figure something else out, right? And so I think, it was during that time that I started to realize, this system, reforms are not going to change it. We in DC, where I practice, we got a lot of reforms. DC is better than a lot of jurisdictions, right? We got the body cameras. We got access to the police misconduct information. So now we're able to see the injustice, right? Now we're able to see, how many complaints an officer has gotten for harassment in the community. And we're able to get some of them fired, but it doesn't stop. Now we're able to have diversity, right? We have police forces where the faces are Black in Southeast DC, Black police officers, right? The judges are Black. There are Black prosecutors, and still over 90% of the people incarcerated in DC's jails are Black, right? Black people being arrested for drug use is significantly more than white people, although we know that they use at similar rates, right? These things, these reforms don't change anything, and they don't make us safer. They do not reduce crime, and there's plenty of research to show that. And so I think what I've engaged in over the last few years is a willingness to not have to have an answer for what this world looks like without prisons and police. I don't need that answer anymore. I have certain examples, right, that are happening all over the country, but I do not need proof that they work, because I have proof that what we have doesn't work, and it's harmful, right? It's making us less safe, in fact. So that is how I approach abolition. That is how I think of it. And I'm constantly learning and hoping to just be more courageous in not needing all the answers and still supporting abolition.
All of your words have been so compelling thus far, but again, just to echo back some of these remarks, understanding that abolition is a practice, it's a state of mind, and once again, you are referencing the internal work that we have to do to realize why is abolition a viable, workable pathway forward. Quote, I have proof that what we have is not working. So why am I holding abolition to a higher standard when I see what is not working? Especially appreciated these remarks. I think often abolition is not merely cast as unrealistic, but that those who are proponents of abolition, you can't care about victims. You don't know, you don't have that lived experience. And I so appreciate you bringing that here. That's often what informs my position as well, growing up in the projects, growing up with family members who were both incarcerated, growing up with folks who supported jails and prisons. And I absolutely agree, talking to clients who would justify, well, someone does need to go to jail or prison. So when you talk to just members of the public, there are plenty of folks, Black and brown folks, who are opposed to these types of steps forward. But then when you actually engage in conversation, when you explain what abolition is, there is often a movement and a realization, I think, to your point, that what we have right now is not working. So thank you so much, really compelling. All right, so I'd like to finally end with Alex, Vitale. Please share with us how you think of conceptualize abolition.
Thank you. It's great to see everyone here sticking it out through this difficult conversation in some ways. I want to build on this conversation about realism, right? Because that is often the line we hear is that, oh, well, this is some utopian fantasy and we're trying to operate in the real world. And I think actually that's completely backwards. that abolition is actually much more grounded in real world experiences, in the actual functioning of institutions, and the actual outcomes of interventions in a way that the criminal legal system is just operating on faith and tradition, is not evidence-based, and is not interested in people's actual lived experiences. It's interested in a politics of theater, of cruelty, and things like that, which I'll talk more about in the later section. Americans love drugs. They love, I mean, they consume massive quantities of drugs. Now, some of them are more or less legal. None of them are completely legal, right? We have restrictions on nicotine. We have restrictions on alcohol. We have restrictions on prescription medication given by a physician. But people are using drugs in huge quantities to manage their state of mind. They are self-medicating stress, mental disorders, physical disorders, etc. Now, most of this turns out not to be particularly that harmful. So that's, as was pointed out earlier, that's one of the big misconceptions. Even the use of what we call hard drugs like opioids and cocaine, the vast majority of usage is by people who get up and go to work every day and sometimes party on the weekends, or maybe even have a daily opioid habit. But it turns out not to be this life-destroying thing, right? The harms are tied to, on the one hand, the process of criminalization, and on the other hand, deeper kinds of problems related to poverty and inability to access high-quality medical care and have stable living situations, et cetera. The criminal legal system persists in a completely naive and unrealistic worldview that if we engage in moralistic finger wagging backed up by punishment, that this will change people's robot-like cost-benefit calculations and they'll just stop doing whatever it is we tell them to stop doing or else. But any casual look at the situation shows that this is utterly ridiculous. We have been waging a war on drugs for over 50 years in the modern form, and drugs are cheaper, easier to get, of higher potency than they've ever been. Anyone in our society can get any kind of drugs whenever they want them. We have put literally millions of human beings into cages. We have directly contributed to millions of unnecessary deaths, and we have absolutely nothing to show for it. Nothing. So how is that realistic? It's not. Abolition is about, for me at least, it's about an analysis. It's not about some preordained utopian future. It's an analysis that says, first of all, these kinds of punitive and coercive criminal legal interventions just don't work very well. This is especially true with the issue of drugs. But it's true in almost everything that we think that they're doing. They are not protecting women from sexual assaults. They are not stopping school shooters from coming in and killing our kids, right? They are not preventing the violence. And they're certainly not preventing anybody from getting drugs. But even in those cases where a case can be made, we have an econometric study that shows a 3% reduction in armed robberies in a 6-block area if we do this very intense. Okay, maybe that's possible, right? But the costs of those interventions do not justify their usage. So we have 1 or 2 studies. Oh no, every dollar spent on policing gives us $1.25 of benefits, but they do not make any effort to calculate the actual costs of policing, of incarceration, of probation of the conditions required in mental health and substance abuse courts, et cetera. The Vera Institute recently, just last year, issued a report on the cost of policing based on what is still a fairly limited amount of high quality research. And it just showed there are huge unmeasured costs to public health, to public well-being, to the stability of communities, not to mention the unbelievable financial costs. And we have people who will come and say, well, what we need is a balanced approach. You know, we need tough enforcement and some community interventions. But when we look carefully, what they really mean is we need 99% of resources to continue to be invested in criminalization, and maybe 1%, some of which is still under their control, will allow that to be spent on some feel-good programs. That's not a balanced approach. We don't have anything even remotely appearing to be a balanced approach. Finally, we have other things we could do. It's not like our choices are limited to policing, criminalization, or nothing. And of course, this is the choice, the false choice that's given primarily to poor communities of color. It's like, oh, you got a problem? Well, you can have more police or you can have nothing. You cannot have the empty community center down the street fixed up and reopened and filled with programs. You cannot have community-based mental health services. You cannot have drug treatment on demand. You cannot have employment opportunities for your children. You cannot have stable housing. You can't have any of the things that would actually make this a healthier, safer community. But if you ask nicely, we'll give you more police. And in fact, even if you tell us you don't want them, we'll give you more police. But we have lots of other things we could do. Now, yes, we need 1 million experiments. We need research about their relative effectiveness over time. Once we have something that begins to look more like an actual balanced approach, but we have plenty of examples of how we could address the vast majority of what policing does right now. We just need the political will to begin to implement these things. And that's has to be understood that this is about a process. This is not about a preordained conclusion and we wait for some revolutionary moment and then we sneakily disappear all police and you're on your own. Right? There's no world where that's going to happen. It's not possible. Anyone who says, oh, they just want the purge is not listening and is intentionally misrepresenting these ideas and is being completely unrealistic because no one at this table has the power to just disappear the police. What we're talking about is a process of making actual decisions right now about problems we are confronted with right now that are informed by the analysis that I've laid out. So that folks in Memphis, when confronted with the Tyree Nichols situation, were offered the opportunity to put a lot more money in the police budget for training. And they said, no, we have an abolitionist analysis. We want to end pretextual stops. We want to get rid of these violent and invasive units, and we want more investments in youth services, decriminalization of low-level car violations, right? Those are decisions that we have to make right now that the city council in Memphis is actively debating. This is not about imagining some far-off future. It's about preventing us from making really ridiculous mistakes and investing more money in things that we know are not going to help and trying to turn the tide. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So much from all of you that I've been able to jot down, understanding that abolition is actually grounded in the world rather than a criminal legal system that is exclusively operating on faith, tradition and a presumption that folks are engaging in a cost-benefit analysis that is going to be responsive to punitive prohibitionist policies. Loved abolition is an analysis that tells us that punitive, coercive approaches just don't work well. They're not stopping school shootings. They're not protecting our most vulnerable, the people that we should be thinking the most about. They're not stopping the things, the problems that we're most concerned about. And that abolition as an analysis tells us there are other things that we can do, that the response does not exclusively have to be policing and criminalization, that people are, they're entitled to something that is employment, to meeting their basic needs. So really appreciate these insightful remarks just to kick us off. Okay, so at this stage, understanding that there might be a host of thoughts going through one's mind, hearing about abolition and abolitionist theory, I wanted to actually name some of what might be going through people's heads, conversations that one might have after hearing panels like this about, well, this is just really unrealistic. Legal reforms represent the best or most practical approach. So I wanted to give each of the panelists an opportunity to actually address some of these claims, some of these beliefs that we don't necessarily clearly articulate at all times. All right, so I'd like to start off this first claim, which is not reading very well here, okay? It seems like it might have changed my dynamic. So I'll read out this claim. So the claim states that 1, the primary harm of the war on drugs and drug criminalization more broadly is mandatory minimum sentences. Okay, so I'd like to have Alex to start us off, but I do want to invite all of the panelists for each of these claims. Please feel free to respond if you'd like to.
Okay, so yes, I think that, you know, we're caught up in a very kind of narrow politics of the possible, of short-term political calculations of what can we get given the political facts on the ground. Now, that's not necessarily a huge problem as long as the interventions we engage in are rooted in an abolitionist analysis, rather than an analysis that is designed to restore legitimacy to these institutions and these processes, or to continue to empower certain kinds of framings of the issue in ways that make what we really want and know will work best more difficult to achieve. So do we want to get rid of, you know, the long mandatory sentences? Yes, I'm fine with that. I've signed on to some campaigns, you know, to do just that. Do we want to get some people out of prison who've been there, you know, under these incredibly punitive regimes? Absolutely. I was very active for many years in the Drop the Rock effort in New York State to overturn the Rockefeller era mandatory minimum drug laws. But we have to be careful about how we do this work. If it is grounded only in a kind of poster child approach that says an injustice was done in this one case where the extremes were so extreme that it just doesn't feel right and we could fix it, that to me is not the solution. That implies that there is an appropriate criminal justice response. It just needs to be more measured, more targeted, more efficient, despite the fact that there's still no evidence that it actually works. So we have a concept of, you know, reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms. So what can we do to try to unpack the legitimacy of these systems, understanding that we can't do everything at once? Well, my view right now is that I'm just incredibly pessimistic about what can be achieved in Washington and to some extent in the states. I mean, we're making great progress on marijuana legalization, which I fully support. My view is we need much more work to change the facts on the ground. So Jonathan earlier, I felt he was like, what we need are better negotiators who are more willing to compromise given the existing facts on the ground on a panel this morning, our guest from Washington, and that the advocates need to be less strident and more compromise oriented. And I think this is entirely the wrong approach. I think what we need to do is we need to put our emphasis on organizers. We're not going to win these battles by making the best arguments, and we're not going to get what we really want compromising under the existing conditions. Now, this is going to be hard news for some, people will not be happy to hear this, right? But I think that we're wasting a lot of time in Washington trying to achieve incremental things that are not moving the ball in the way we need. And we need to focus on keeping people out of these systems in the first place. And that means we got to work at the local level to undermine the basic operations of these institutions. And we have to do that through community organizing so that people know they have choices other than police or nothing to address the problems that they face. Thank you.
Anyone want to add anything? I'm particularly curious as a former public defender, what were some of the maybe unexpected things that folks don't necessarily appreciate about how prohibitionist policies can touch individual criminal cases?
Yeah. So
Your mic.
What you, I completely agree with what you said about wasting time in Washington. I don't, know how familiar you are with what has been happening in DC locally, but it's been, on a national scale with revising the DC criminal code that is from 1901, right? So there are a bunch of changes that people worked on for years, for like 16 years or something ridiculous like that, to agree, people from all different sides of everything, right? To agree on like this revised code that's better than what we have, but like it's still like awful and it's still in practice not going to help people, right? But it's shut down by Congress, so it's not going to get passed. And even if it were to get passed, there's a shift in the implementation. So what I mean is DC decriminalized marijuana, right? So you can no longer be prosecuted for possession of a certain amount of marijuana, but you can't consume marijuana publicly. So who does that impact disproportionately, right? It impacts unhoused people. It impacts Black and brown people. It's a basis for arrests and stops and all of this, right? If I smell marijuana, if you're out in the public, whatever, right? Like that disproportionately impacts certain people. Get rid of mandatory minimums for drugs. The maximum for a felony drug offense in DC is 30 years. In reality, no one really gets 30 years anymore, but it's still on the books and people are still afraid of it. And so when they're, deciding whether or not to take a plea or to challenge like the unconstitutional search that the police officer did in their case, they're looking at that 30 years, right? And when you look at sentences, like the disproportionate, impact that it has on, people who are poor and Black and brown people is undeniable, right? So you can take away these things, but the practice is still harmful. So we need to just get away from the system entirely in order to see real change.
Thank you. Okay. Second claim. Hopefully this will show up as I format it. Yeah, these are just, they've changed a bit. Okay, so this second claim, apologies if it's a bit unclear. So legal reforms like drug courts and law enforcement assisted diversion programs are the best option for protecting public safety and communities of color. So I'd like Aliza to start us off with your response to this particular claim. Or I'm sorry, this is Alex. I'm sorry. So I'll start off with Ieshaah since you actually just gave some remarks. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Aliza, you're like, no, this was not what I planned. Sorry. Okay, I'll start with Ieshaah and then Alex.
So I'll just say, one of the things that I hate about, this talk about diversion and about drug courts is that, they sound great, right? But in reality, they operate just like drug courts, just like regular court. It's just, you're in a different, you're in front of a different judge, you get more chances to mess up, right? But you're still sanctioned in the way that you would be sanctioned in regular court. You're still, you have a bunch of requirements like you would in regular court. And these types of things are not available to most people. So most people who are impacted by the system are not eligible for the drug courts and the diversion programs. So it's not impacting safety because it's not reaching the people that are actually in the system. And I think that gets left out of the conversation. It kind of seems like, we have these, things that give people more chances and create safety, et cetera. But if a small portion of people are eligible, and of those people that are eligible, a very small percentage actually complete it, then what is it really doing?
These are reformist reforms. They're designed to re-legitimate systems. And the reason they are popular is because everyone knows that the underlying criminal legal interventions are unjust and ineffective. And so they're desperate to find some way to make it seem like it's okay. So let's introduce a few social workers, let's introduce a few treatment services, but let's continue to do it within the control of a coercive and violent criminal legal system that is completely ineffective. And so what does the research show? It shows that they don't work very well, that not only they don't work, that they're the same, they're actually worse. Drug courts are actually worse. The outcomes are worse. So the initial research done by the proponents and runners of these courts were like, oh, this is amazing. We have all these successes around recidivism but if you look carefully, what they did is they only looked at the people who completely finished the program, not everyone going in the front door. When we look at everyone going in the front door, it turns out their outcomes are worse than if we just sent them to regular jail at higher cost and less effectiveness. So they don't work, they don't fix the problem, and jails and courts are the worst possible place for people to address their substance use problems.
Sean, can I add
Yeah.
to that? Because I've been following the care courts out of California. I don't know if you all have been watching that proposal. And so I just pulled up the PowerPoint, right, which Governor Newsom uses to roll out the program. The two goals are acting early to get people the support they need, setting them up with an individualized care plan. Sounds great on the PowerPoint slide, right? And then you look, and in particular, it's responding to Californians who are suffering from untreated mental health and substance use disorders leading to homelessness, incarceration, or worse. So what does this particular program do? It singles out people with schizophrenia and schizo-related disorders and other psychiatric disorders for eligibility. So specific classes of people with disabilities are identified in this particular statute as a way of, wait for it, working around the legal protections under the state's civil commitment laws, which advocates had worked for decades to try to modify, to increase the legal protections for the deprivation of liberty, right, and going into these programs. And in large part, I'd like to think that it was motivated by the compassion on the part of, California legislators, but indeed, it's been motivated by the fact that the state is experiencing an affordable and accessible housing crisis that's putting people in public spaces who are having crises, who are having overdoses, who are experiencing the violence of the precarious conditions that they live in. And so I guess I just want to, point to the abolitionist analysis that's deeply rooted in the structural conditions, and to suggest that in a way, what we're seeing right now are, again, not only just punitive responses, indeed they're that, but sort of the gloss of care, right? We just throw care on it, and then indeed we can, cover up the net widening effects of these particular programs, the fact that they're targeting individual classes of people with disabilities and individuals that have substance use dependencies. And I think that in a way that sort of points to one of the insights of abolition, which is if you don't get at the root causes, mainly our social responses to non-normative psychiatric conditions, let's say, or neurodivergence, if we don't get the root causes and societies move to police, segregate, and isolate these groups, as it has done, largely since the rise of the asylum, then these particularly punitive measures will just be reconstituted in new forms. And so I just wanted to lift that as a particular example and encourage us all to sort of, I'll also call out, Mayor Adams' proposal as well to sweep people off the streets of New York, I think, as he said in one interview, so we don't have to see somebody dying from an overdose in public space. Yeah.
Could I also add? I completely agree with what's been said. I want to add that I was struck and frankly a bit troubled by the comments on a comment on the previous panel that was sort of flippantly saying someone couldn't complete a diversion program, all they had to do was report a few times a year and get a positive or get a negative drug test, et cetera, et cetera. And it's frankly, diversion programs are very difficult to do. I had enough trouble getting here at 8 a.m. this morning, and I'm in a hotel a couple minutes away, right? It's diversion programs or drug courts require that people report randomly for drug tests at certain times. They have to drop everything. So if you're trying to hold down a job, if you have childcare responsibilities, let alone if you live in a rural area and don't have access to transportation, they're setting people up to fail. And I do think it's not just that diversion programs widen the net. It's also that it puts this immense burden on an individual when it's a structural problem.
We talked a bit about in these remarks, drug courts. I worked for a policy organization that was doing a LEAD program on law enforcement assisted diversion in Albany at the time. And this was maybe 2017, 2018, the emerging findings painted a relatively positive picture that folks were being removed out of the criminal legal system for minor offenses. But could any of you just speak briefly to what you see as some of the concerns attending law enforcement assisted diversion in particular?
So the best argument I've heard for it is that the police and the criminal legal system have so much political power that the only way we can ever win any actual services for people in need is to cooperate with them and hope that they will see the need for those services and will quit blocking funding for them. But this hasn't really panned out. So yes, turns out that if we can get people out of the criminal legal system as soon as possible, that's better for them. But ultimately, if the diversion programs are either punitive in the way described or just empty, then people are just going to find themselves back in the same situation, are going to become a source of disorder that will then engender more political blowback, and we won't really have solved anything. So the LEAD, crisis intervention teams, to the extent that we've seen some positive impact of these things, it's because these cities also made more baseline services available. So let's just make more baseline services available and keep it out of the criminal legal system, which contributes to worse outcomes.
Right. Thank you. All right. Hopefully we'll see if the formatting, it was dark. My apologies. Okay. Claim 3, decriminalization and legalization are inherently at odds with abolition. I'd like to start with Aliza. Hopefully I'm right this time.
Yeah. I'm gonna start by offering a bit of some definitions about decrim and abolition. But to start, abolition offers a deeper and I'd posit more accurate analysis of harm, as we've discussed. An abolitionist analysis calls on us to recognize that social problems like addiction and crime occur not primarily because of individual failure, but because of systemic failures like drug prohibition, a lack of robust, accessible healthcare, a lack of economic security, and more. Decriminalization and legalization, I think, can be understood as policies that in part attempt to account for and correct some of this systemic failure and government abandonment. So first, what do we mean by decriminalization? Decriminalization is the full removal of criminal penalties for drug possession and personal use law violations. Here I'm talking about not just marijuana, but all drugs. When implemented, people are no longer arrested or incarcerated for possessing or using small amounts of drugs. Decriminalization efforts can, but don't inherently increase funding for needed addiction and harm reduction services. With over 1 million drug arrests each year, the majority of which are for possession alone, decriminalization is one of the most immediate, urgent steps we can take to rectify our drug policies. We can think of it as a non-reformist reform, a reform that is removing the power of police to arrest someone for drugs. I'd suggest, though, that while decriminalization can be abolitionist, it's not inherently abolitionist. If decriminalization removes criminal penalties, but then instead forces people to complete a diversion program or else risk criminal sanctions, it's not abolitionist. If decrim coerces someone into treatment, it's not abolitionist. And if decrim involves the imposition of hefty fines and fees, it's not abolitionist. And beyond this, there are still practical and political challenges when drug sales remain illegal. For example, we have to establish thresholds that define personal use, meaning that any amount of a drug below a certain amount or under X grams is not a criminal offense, but above X grams will be a criminal offense. But people have different tolerances, or people might buy for friends or buy in bulk, especially if they live in a more rural area. One alternative to thresholds could be that we leave it up to police to use discretion for what constitutes personal use, but we know that this too would come with problems. So there's no pure solution. As I mentioned, though, given the profound number of drug arrests each year and the cascade of impacts that come from arrests, I still think that decriminalization should be an urgent priority. When advocating for decrim, we should take care to ensure that we're not widening the net of criminalization or creating new or harsher penalties. We should use decrim as a mechanism to decrease police power and decouple care from criminalization. And lastly, as I mentioned, we should think about decrim not just in the context of arrests or within the criminal legal system, but throughout all aspects of people's lives in spaces like healthcare, housing, and education. That said, if we're serious about ending the crisis of criminalization and the overdose crisis, we should conceptualize decriminalization as a stepping stone to legalization or safe supply. So what do I mean by legalization? Legalization establishes legal regulations for the creation and distribution of drugs. And again, I'm talking about all drugs, not just marijuana. This is often branded by opponents as too radical or a drug free for all. But in reality, it's one of the drug policies that would do most to increase health and safety. Legalization or safe supply would ensure that people who use drugs know exactly what they're getting. This means there will be a legally regulated way for people to access drugs so that people don't need to access illicit forms of drugs that are often contaminated with one or multiple toxic additives. Under legal regulation and safe supply, drugs would be held to procedures similar to government-regulated consumer goods. They'd be sealed, packaged, meet rigorous quality control requirements. And legalization puts in safeguards and protections, such as age restrictions, for example. Like decrim, we need to be thoughtful about how we're legalizing, not just that we are legalizing. Legalization does not, and in my opinion, should not mean commercialization. There are different regulation models we could choose, including state-run systems, compassion clubs, or co-ops, and nonprofits. We should ensure access to regulated drugs so that it's not only wealthy white people who benefit from regulation. And we should, to the extent possible, not create new criminal penalties or new pockets of enforcement. And like decriminalization, we should couple legalization with expanded access to harm reduction and treatment services. And of course, legalization should be driven by people who use drugs. If your concern is increased drug use, which I imagine, and maybe for some of you, available evidence is, though somewhat mixed and depends on the state and the study, suggests that we'll likely not see a long-term sustained increase in drug use after decrim or legalization. And if your concern is crime, many researchers, I think including my panelists up here, attest that crime is much more complex than one single policy. And that in fact, if we were to actually reduce criminalization and invest in healthcare and harm reduction, housing and economic security and in infrastructure, we'd actually see increased public safety. And ultimately, we make these trade-offs and calculations all the time. I think better questions than will use increase are how might people act now that they do not fear arrest or punishment for seeking support or for using drugs? How would reduced stigma towards people who use drugs transform our social relations? Decriminalization and legalization, when done right, will be life-saving, make us safer and healthier, and will affirm the autonomy of people who use drugs. There's not one way to decriminalize or legalize, which is one of the exciting things, and abolition invites us to envision these together.
Great, thank you. Anything to add? I definitely have a follow-up for, yes.
I'm sure many of you know that Portugal decriminalized all drugs. Civilization did not collapse. It's okay. I was there this summer. They're very happy. The police have nothing to do with it for the most part.
Right, anything to add, Ieshaah?
So I think one of the arguments for being tough on drugs, you know, and that I've seen in my practice by prosecutors and judges and lawmakers is that it is it's often the source of more violent crime. So, you know, for example, you have a homicide case that literally what happened is somebody stole somebody's stash of drugs, and that is what resulted in the person killing the victim, right? The decedent. I think decriminalization and legalization will reduce violent crime because it is, there's less of a need to hide and to be kind of, you know, to live in this underground world of criminal activity. So I think we really need to start looking at the impact that not only decriminalization and legalization has with drug users, right, and people who are charged with drug crimes and that, but what it will lead to in terms of other crimes, violent crimes, and making communities safer in that respect as well.
Okay, I did have one quick follow-up. Aliza, could you maybe just speak briefly? You said, I support legalization, not commercialization. And so how are you drawing that distinction?
Yeah, I mean, probably the marijuana experts here can speak to that much more. But as we've seen with marijuana legalization across the US, there have been different models that people have taken. And I think what we've seen in some states is that these, you know, big companies swoop in, the John Boehners of the world swoop in and sort of set up monopolies, right? That's not something that I envision based on my sort of personal politics, but also based on what I actually think will be best for people who use drugs and what will give people the most access to people who use drugs. So I'd offer that we imagine a bit about what legalization could look like if it's not just these big businesses where you don't, you know, where it could be co-ops, right? And I think our neighbors in Canada have offered some interesting models for what that could look like.
Let's look at gambling for a second, right? One of the main activities of police 75 years ago or so was the suppression of gambling, which was involved with organized crime, huge amounts of violence, and we legalized it. I mean, basically, we have lotteries in almost every state that are state controlled. We now have legalized sports betting pretty much every, in a growing number of places. I don't know the exact figures. The problem is that it's been commercialized, which means that states are actually spending a huge part of the money that they take in on more advertising to try to get more poor people to put their limited income into gambling. And I think the sports betting is going to have negative impacts on people who have gambling problems for a variety of reasons. So do I think we should criminalize it? No. I think it's great that we've taken it out of the criminal legal arena, but I do think it should be regulated. I think, for instance, lotteries should not be allowed to advertise and sports betting should not be allowed to advertise. It's there, people know about it, they can access it, but we should not allow it to be trying to generate more demand. And especially for governments to be doing this, I think is just unforgivable.
Thank you. Okay, final claim. Hopefully shows up a bit better, okay. Substance use is not a disability and is best regulated through the criminal process. Professor Moritz.
Yeah, so I've been, thinking about this in the context of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which carves out sort of current use of illegal substances from the protections under the main federal disability law that we have here in the States. And so, we obviously, I think at this stage realize that there are public health studies that indicate that a substance use dependency is indeed a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, just to take from the terms of the statute. And so, there's thinking within another number of disability rights spaces as to one, obviously, legalizing, but also removing this carve-out protection to allow for access to things like medically assisted treatment within jail facilities, which Title II regulates public entities under under the Title II provision dealing with government services, and to kind of think more expansively about how a disability rights frame for individuals that have substance use dependencies can improve their access to treatment and also be used to sort of challenge the coercive conditions that they also find themselves in, often in jails in particular. So I'll just say that very quickly and stop.
Yeah, my follow-up would be, as we're talking about non-reformist reforms, possibilities, that one end goal might be decriminalization, legalization. Should it be that our end goal is for substance use to be conceptualized as disability? Is that part of an objective that you would want to realize? If so, why? And if not, maybe why? Yeah.
No, not the end goal, but I guess, sitting in a law school and teaching law students, like I do see law as part of a role towards harm reduction. And I think the rights protective frame is limited, of course, right? We're not going to get to any liberatory future through rights. But I'm sort of steeped in an understanding that rights carve out space for organizing and shifting power. And so when I'm talking about sort of the criminalization of disability, of which we can see maybe substance use dependency looped into that, right? Our punitive responses to drug use and possession, that's shifting, right? That's one area where we can say the reforms are moving in the right direction, at least in having the conversation that, personal use should not be criminalized. But I guess I really want to challenge us to think, I went to law school, I teach law students because I really believe in this aspect, right? It's not the only tool, but it gives us breathing room. Those of us that are concerned with protecting the rights of the most marginalized, like in a way, it can carve out a space for more radical imaginings. I think more directly, it can respond not immediately, because these cases go on for many years in some cases, but we saw during the COVID era, right? Some, preliminary injunctions, getting people out or getting them the PPE that they needed in the COVID era. So I don't want to discredit law entirely, but I totally reject that it should be the end all. It's just, again, we're moving towards reimagining how we respond to social problems. I think law gives us space, not only to protect rights, but I'm not just thinking about rights, right? Because that's the floor. If we're just saying what the Constitution provides, certainly not that expansive in certain cases. So I'm suggesting that law and the enforcement of legal rights, maybe through federal disability law, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, can create protections that might save lives immediately and then push towards more radical futures.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so we will officially move into question and answer. I have quite a number I've jotted down myself, hearing all of your insights. But does anyone have a question or a comment?
Not a one.
We do have one from online.
And we do have one from online. Great. Okay. So we'll start with you. Okay.
If we are supportive of the abolitionist approach, what are some actions we can take? I agree with all of these sentiments, but being solution focused, I am curious of what can be done right here, right now to move this work forward.
Great.
So, I mean, let's just keep it on the drug front. There's a million things we could do. We could get police out of schools and hire counselors. We could create non-police mental health response teams. We could support community-based violence reduction. But on the drugs front, you want to list a couple of specific interventions that we could be supporting as alternatives to criminalization?
Yes, lots of interventions. I mean, it's sort of course, it's location dependent. I would say one of the most immediate things we should be doing around the country is opening overdose prevention centers, also known as supervised consumption sites or safe injection sites, where people can bring in pre-obtained drugs and use them under medical supervision, and also get connected to other harm reduction and treatment services. Overdose prevention sites are probably one of the most studied policies and interventions, with over like hundreds and hundreds of studies. And yet they face immense political opposition. But advocating for those is like hugely, hugely important. There hasn't been a single overdose death in an overdose prevention center worldwide since they've been open for the past couple of decades. So that's one. And then in terms of if you're interested in sort of the organizing front, I would say like contact your local or get connected with your local harm reduction program, whether that's a syringe service program or something else, because a lot of people there are already thinking about the changes that need to happen in your community, and are really thoughtful and have the connections and have been organizing for a long time. So I would say support your local harm reduction group as well.
And I just want to add one thing, court watch. Figure out what's going on wherever you are, and in drug courts, mental health courts, whatever type of court, so you can actually see what's happening, because it is very, it's not what is portrayed in the media. So, I always recommend that people who are not familiar with what's happening, just go and court watch, and you'll see for yourself.
And I would add, absolutely want to echo all that's been proposed. But one of the very early messages from our panelists was the work that we each must do in order to understand abolition. And much of what I'm doing is having conversation with family and friends. And so one thing that I would recommend, again, I'll share the last slide, which will have some potential reading resources, but I really would recommend that folks familiarize themselves with what is abolition, because often, particularly if you're a law school student or an attorney, you're going to be in spaces where people will be curious and ask you, and you need to actually be able to explain what is an abolitionist vision, part of what we hoped to contribute by way of our conversation today. So I would say, starting off even minimally, the reading, understanding abolition, and also if you don't have lots of capacity and time, monetary contributions to on the ground organizations. As Aliza mentioned, we have local harm reduction programs, lots of organizers and activists who are doing this work on the ground that really need our money. And so I think that making those types of donations can also be helpful.
Shout out to Vocal New York.
Yes.
I think I heard someone on the panel say that the idea that governments are, sort of promoting the overconsumption of drugs is really problematic. And I see that with legal cannabis, where we're taxing by THC content and we're passing these laws because of the tax revenue and let's, sell more. That's the promise that, and a lot of times is how this legislation gets through, appealing to that economic motive. And on the psychedelic side, I think there is some openness to like, this could help people, but only certain people, only vets, only first responders. So I'm kind of curious, knowing that the extreme is we should just want to help all people and public safety should be the imperative. And I agree with everything you've said, but, what are some strategies for how beyond just we can tax it and make money off of it, how to advocate for the kind of, law reform that you're all talking about? A hard question.
I'm grateful that I'm not pushing this policy and I'm behind the scenes. No, but I need to collect my thoughts more. But one thing I would offer and commend my colleagues in New York on in our New York policy office, so Melissa Moore and Cassandra Frederick, as well as a bunch of others, is that they had the opportunity to pass the MRTA, or the Marijuana Regulation and Tax Act, a few years ago. And they ended up walking away from it because ultimately they were like, this doesn't include the important provisions that we want it to. This doesn't include the automatic expungement stuff. This doesn't include non-citizens in the protection, like X number of things. And I think despite sort of the like gloom and doom of our political situation today, I think like having those sort of principles are super important and admirable and poise us for like more successful drug policy. That's not just about money and tax benefits, et cetera. Anyone else want to start?
I mean, it's not that we can't have systems of taxation included in legalization schemes, but what we want to be careful about is, are we giving corporations a free hand to try to drum up more demand? And I think that's a legitimate concern. And, so we need to think about reasonable regulation, but it has to be reasonable or it will just recreate the black market problems that we started with. And we have to remember that Americans love drugs.
Hi, I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a licensed independent substance use disorder clinician in Arizona, and I'll be going to law school next year. So, oh boy. Sort of just a comment. I think that there is sort of like misconceptions about what treatment is and what it's not and how it is structured, and not enough people are kind of reaching out and even engaging with the people who are doing the work or who are trying to do the work in the most respectful way possible and comprehensive way possible. But I mean, we are paid like nothing to do really difficult work. And there's a lot of issues with turnover and people leaving the field. And, I think that it would be helpful to engage more practitioners, and I'd be happy to do that. I sit on the board of the Arizona Association of Addiction Professionals. We have, over 1,000 people I wish more could come today. So that's just a little plug. I also straddle a different community. I'm a chronic pain patient, and I think that abolition has a lot of potential to help the chronic pain community, which has been hurt immeasurably by the war on drugs, not just restriction of access to the medications that work, people having to be pushed to the illicit supply, and also people who have committed suicide because they had no other options. So, yeah.
I think people doing that work should get paid and have the same benefits that police have.
Thank you so much for that. In terms of lenses that we can constantly be incorporating into our advocacy, really appreciate you naming the chronic pain community and the pathway that abolition might offer. Okay, so I believe we are at time. Might we end briefly with each of you all sharing what keeps you engaged in making this type of recommendation that you're consistently told is unpopular, unrealistic? What is it that motivates you, that drives you to continue sharing this message to maintain that hope, as I referenced at the beginning by way of Miriam Kava?
I can start. Right now I run a criminal defense clinic where I supervise my students in representing people in misdemeanor offenses, and all I see are just drugs and mental illness, the criminalization of Blackness, of poverty, of everything. And so that keeps me motivated. I'm really grateful to have this experience, because my experience as a public defender was not with the misdemeanor, people charged with misdemeanors. It was with serious felonies, serious crimes. But when you represent folks in misdemeanor court, you really see just how awful our system is and how unresponsive it is to the problems in our society. And so there is no way that I can do this without constantly speaking up for what is happening. For abolition, because I don't see how we achieve, our goals, my goal of Black liberation without abolition.
I have the privilege to be in about 20 plus cities a year. And what I see are victories all over the place. Dozens of cities getting rid of their school police departments and putting in restorative justice and counseling. Dozens of cities creating non-police mental health and substance abuse crisis teams. Dozens of cities creating new community-based anti-violence efforts. Cities getting police out of traffic enforcement. I see organizations and individuals who thought we could fix policing with body cameras and changes to use of force policies, embracing these new ideas. So, I started doing this work before Ferguson, before, anyone was talking about police abolition. So to me, I just see tremendous progress in the face of very hard, opposition, entrenched interests. So we have tremendous amount of work to do, but I see victories all the time.
I wish I could be so optimistic. I think what keeps me going, is, my clients, the clients that I've lost, the family members that I've lost, just the scope of human suffering, like as someone that has a faith practice, like the scope of human suffering motivates me. I think we all are maybe united with wanting to make the conditions better for all of us. But at bottom, I think that abolition offers more possibilities and actual ways of doing that. We're seeing it today. Those are the victories that you talked about. That's what, I think I focus on. And then I think lastly, hope, even in these times, that if we come together, that we can find new ways of responding to these problems and ending the human suffering.
I'll try to combine some of the optimism and pessimism. I think a lot about the time several years ago during the pandemic, Drug Policy Alliance held like a closed door series of meetings with different people drug users unions and people who use drugs around the country to sort of learn about safe supply models and hear what people who use drugs want most. Over that time and since, I think we've lost 3 or 4 people to overdose from that. And I think about that a lot of like just the profound loss that we see every day from overdose, from criminalization, from everything else. And yet, like, there's tremendous organizing happening among a lot of groups, especially among drug users unions, especially among harm reduction and treatment workers. It's really exciting. I think about Vocal New York. I think about North Carolina Survivors Union, lots of other places around the country, the National Survivors Union, that are being super creative and innovative and doing brilliant organizing and policy work and writing and thinking. So I feel really motivated and excited by that.
All right, please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists. If you are interested in learning a bit more about abolition, we have a tremendous amount of resources available. Our panelists themselves have also written extensively, whether law review articles or otherwise, so please feel free to look them up, but just wanted to share a couple of popular, accessible pieces. But thank you again to our panelists, and thanks to you all for questionings and comments.